"I'm not taking care of that old witch," my daughter-in-law whispered, loud enough for the silence of the chapel to carry every word straight to me. I didn't turn around. I didn't flinch. I just kept my eyes on the polished wooden casket in front of me, my hands folded neatly in my lap as if I hadn't heard a thing. The air inside St. Andrew's felt too still, too heavy, like even the walls were holding their breath. My son, Michael Harper, was being laid to rest on a grey Tuesday morning, and yet somehow, the coldest thing in that room wasn't death, it was the woman standing 3 feet behind me. I could feel people shift uncomfortably in their seats, the faint rustle of black fabric, the quiet clearing of throats that tried to pretend nothing had happened. No one said a word. No one ever does. I had spent 71 years believing that family meant something unbreakable, something sacred, especially in moments like this. But as I sat there, staring at the brass handles of my son's casket, I realized something had already broken long before today. Brittany Cole had always been careful. Polite in public. Sweet when it mattered. Calculated in ways that were easy to miss if you weren't looking closely. But grief has a way of stripping people down to who they really are. And in that moment, she wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. I could hear her heels clicking softly against the marble floor as she shifted her weight, probably checking her phone, probably already thinking about what came next. Not for Michael. Not for the family. For herself. I kept my posture straight, my chin slightly lifted, the way my husband used to remind me whenever life tried to bend me. "Never let them see you break, Evelyn," he would say. And so I didn't. Not when my son's hand grew cold in mine at the hospital 3 days ago. Not when Brittany barely looked at me while signing paperwork. And certainly not now. The minister's voice droned softly in the background, speaking about love, about legacy, about a life well lived. I wondered if anyone else in that room noticed how quickly those words lost their meaning when spoken over quiet cruelty. I wondered if Michael would have believed this moment possible. The boy who used to run into my arms after school. The man who once promised, with that same earnest smile, that I would never be alone. I didn't look back at Brittany. I didn't need to. I already knew the expression she was wearing. I had seen it before, in small flashes, hidden between smiles and polite conversation. But today, it was out in the open. And for the first time, I allowed myself to accept something I had been avoiding for far too long. I was not family to her. Maybe I never had been. The service continued, voices blending into a distant hum, but I heard nothing else after that whisper. Because in that single sentence, she had said everything I needed to hear. And as I sat there, perfectly still, I realized something else just as clearly. She thought I was weak. She thought grief had made me smaller. She thought she could decide what would happen to me next. I let a slow breath settle in my chest, steady and controlled. I kept my hands folded. I kept my expression calm. But deep inside, something had already shifted. And she had no idea. The service ended the way most things do when people are eager to leave, with quiet handshakes, murmured condolences, and eyes that avoided staying too long on mine. I stood when I was supposed to stand, nodded when people spoke to me, and thanked them with a voice that did not quite feel like my own. Outside, the sky hung low and grey, pressing down on the church steps as if it shared the weight I carried. I noticed how quickly Brittany moved once the final hymn faded. She stepped forward before I even had a chance to gather my coat, her hand already resting on the arm of the funeral director as if she were the one in charge. She spoke in a soft, efficient tone, asking about paperwork, timing, arrangements, all the practical things that follow a loss. Not once did she look back at me. Not once did she ask if I was ready. I watched her from a few feet away, still and quiet, like a guest waiting for permission in a house I used to belong to. A few relatives approached me, distant cousins, old neighbors, people who had known Michael since he was a boy. They offered kind words, gentle touches on my arm, but their voices carried a hesitation now, as if they were unsure where I stood in all of this. It was subtle, but I felt it. The shift. The quiet rearranging of roles. When my husband passed years ago, people had looked to me for decisions, for direction. Today, they looked past me. Brittany answered questions before they could reach me. Brittany guided people toward their cars. Brittany accepted sympathy as though it had been addressed to her alone. I stepped down onto the sidewalk, the cool air brushing against my face, and for a moment I simply stood there, unsure of where to go. My son was gone. My place beside him seemed to have vanished with him. Brittany's voice drifted over again, this time clearer, firmer. She was discussing the house. Our house. She spoke about needing space, about changes that would have to be made, about how difficult it would be to manage everything moving forward. The words were careful, almost polite, but the meaning underneath them was not. I felt it settle in my chest, heavy and unmistakable. This was not grief speaking. This was planning. A man from the church offered to walk me to my car, but before I could answer, Brittany stepped in, her smile tight but practiced. She told him she would handle it, that I would be fine. Then she turned to me, finally meeting my eyes, and for a brief second, something flickered there. Not kindness. Not even indifference. It was calculation, sharp and quick, like she was measuring how much longer I would remain part of the equation. I nodded once, as if everything were perfectly normal, and allowed her to guide me down the steps. Her hand hovered near my elbow but never quite touched me, as though even that small gesture required too much effort. Cars pulled away one by one, engines humming softly, carrying away the last witnesses to what had just happened. And as the crowd thinned, the silence returned, deeper this time, more honest. I stood beside Brittany in that emptying parking lot, the wind catching the edge of my coat, and I realized something with a clarity that surprised even me. I was not being pushed aside slowly. I was being replaced. Not with force. Not with noise. But with quiet decisions made without me. I did not argue. I did not question. I simply watched. Because sometimes, the most dangerous thing a person can do is reveal exactly who they are too soon. And Brittany had just done that. I rode home in silence, the passenger seat feeling unfamiliar even though I had sat there countless times before. Brittany drove with both hands on the wheel, her posture straight, her eyes fixed ahead as if the road demanded all of her attention. She did not turn on the radio. She did not speak. The only sound was the steady hum of the engine and the occasional click of the turn signal, each one precise, controlled. I watched the houses pass by through the window, each one looking the same as it always had, yet somehow distant, like I was no longer part of the world I had lived in for decades. When we pulled into the driveway, I noticed something small that I might have ignored before. The porch light had been replaced. A new fixture. Modern. Colder. It cast a sharper glow across the front steps. I stepped out slowly, my shoes pressing against the gravel, and paused for a moment before walking toward the door. Brittany was already ahead of me, keys in hand, unlocking the house with a motion that felt practiced. Too practiced. Inside, everything looked neat. Almost too neat. The living room had been rearranged. Subtle changes. The armchair Michael used to sit in had been moved closer to the window. The photographs on the mantel were spaced differently, as if someone had carefully decided which memories deserved more room. I walked further in, letting my fingers brush lightly against the edge of the table, grounding myself in something familiar. The scent of the house was different too. Cleaner. Less lived in. As though it had already begun forgetting him. Brittany set her purse down and moved through the space with quiet efficiency, removing her shoes, straightening a stack of mail, adjusting a vase that did not need adjusting. She did not ask if I needed anything. She did not ask how I was feeling. Instead, she finally spoke, her voice even, measured. She mentioned schedules. Paperwork. Appointments that needed to be made. Her words moved quickly, one after another, leaving no space for interruption. I listened without responding, the same way I had listened at the church. Because it was not what she was saying that mattered. It was what she was not saying. There was no mention of me staying. No mention of what would happen next for me. Only plans that seemed to move forward without including me at all. I turned slightly, my eyes landing on the hallway that led to my room. The door was closed. That alone was unusual. I had left it open that morning, the way I always did. A small thing. But not to me. I walked toward it slowly, my hand resting on the knob for just a second before I turned it. Inside, everything was in place, but something felt off. The closet door was not fully shut. A box sat near the bed, half filled with neatly folded clothes that I did not remember packing. I stood there, still, taking in the quiet message that did not need to be spoken out loud. Behind me, I could feel Brittany's presence before I heard her voice. Calm. Controlled. She said something about helping me organize, about making things easier in the coming weeks. Her tone was careful, almost considerate, but there was no warmth in it. Only intention. I nodded once, as if I agreed, as if I understood. And in a way, I did. I understood more than she realized. Because this had not started today. It had been building for a long time, in small decisions, in quiet changes, in moments I had dismissed as nothing. Now, standing in that room that no longer felt entirely mine, I allowed those memories to rise, one by one, fitting together with a clarity that left no room for doubt. And as I closed my hand gently around the edge of the box, I realized something steady and certain. She believed she was preparing my exit. What she did not know was that I had already begun paying attention. That night, I did not unpack the box. I left it exactly where it was, half filled, half decided, like a quiet question sitting at the edge of the room. Instead, I sat on the bed with my hands folded in my lap, staring at the closet door. That did not quite close the way it used to. The house had settled into a silence that felt different from grief. Grief is heavy, but it is honest. This silence was careful. Measured. I could hear Brittany moving in the kitchen, the soft clink of dishes, the opening and closing of cabinets, each sound placed neatly into the evening as if she were already rewriting what this home would become. I did not go out to join her. I did not call her name. I simply sat there and let my thoughts move backward, tracing the small details I had ignored for too long. It started long before the hospital. Long before the funeral. I remembered a Sunday afternoon, just a few months ago, when Michael had invited me to sit with him on the porch. He had looked tired, more than he let on, but he smiled the way he always did when he saw me. Brittany had been inside, her voice drifting through the open window, talking on the phone in that light, pleasant tone she used for other people. I had noticed the way Michael kept glancing toward the house, as if measuring his words before speaking. At the time, I thought it was stress. Work. Life. Now, I saw it differently. I remembered how Brittany had begun handling the bills, saying it was easier that way. How she suggested consolidating accounts, organizing documents, simplifying everything for the future. She said it with a smile, always with a reason that sounded practical, responsible. Michael had agreed, trusting, as he always was. I had trusted her too. Or perhaps I had simply chosen not to question it. There were other moments. Small ones. Easy to dismiss. The way she answered questions meant for Michael. The way she gently corrected him in front of others, laughing softly as if it were nothing. The way certain conversations seemed to stop when I entered the room. At the time, I told myself it was adjustment. A young couple finding their rhythm. I did not want to be the kind of mother who interfered. I believed that stepping back was a form of respect. Now, sitting alone in that room, I understood something I had not allowed myself to see before. Stepping back had given her space. And she had used that space carefully. Thoughtfully. I stood up slowly and walked toward the dresser, my reflection catching in the mirror as I passed. For a moment, I paused. I looked at myself not as I had been, but as I was now. A woman who had buried her son. A woman being quietly moved out of her own life. And yet, there was something else there too. Something steady. I reached into the drawer and pulled out a small envelope I had kept for years, untouched, its edges slightly worn. Michael had given it to me a long time ago, insisting I keep it safe, just in case. I had almost forgotten about it. Almost. I held it in my hands, feeling the weight of it, the quiet importance I had never questioned until now. Outside, I could hear Brittany's footsteps moving closer down the hallway, slow and deliberate. I slipped the envelope back into the drawer, closing it gently, my movements calm, unhurried. When she appeared in the doorway, she offered a small, polite smile, the kind that never quite reached her eyes. She asked if I needed anything, her tone light, almost kind. I returned the same calm expression, the same measured stillness I had carried all day. I told her I was fine. And in that moment, for the first time since everything had begun to unfold, I knew that I was not the only one making quiet plans. The next morning arrived without ceremony, just a pale light slipping through the curtains and settling across the floor like nothing had changed. I woke early, earlier than I used to, my body still tied to habits formed over decades of caring for others. For a moment, I lay still, listening. The house was already awake. I could hear Brittany moving downstairs, the faint hum of the coffee machine, the soft tap of her phone against the counter. Everything sounded efficient. Controlled. As if grief had been scheduled between tasks and already completed. I rose slowly, smoothing the blanket behind me out of habit, and dressed in silence. When I stepped into the hallway, the air felt cooler than usual, and I noticed another small change. The framed photograph of Michael and me that used to hang near the staircase was gone. In its place was a neutral landscape print, something distant and forgettable. I paused for a second, letting my eyes rest on the empty space where memory used to live, then continued walking. In the kitchen, Brittany stood with her back to me, scrolling through her phone with one hand while stirring her coffee with the other. She glanced up when she heard my footsteps, her expression polite, composed, already prepared. She greeted me in a tone that suggested normalcy, as though we were simply two people sharing a house, not two people standing on opposite sides of something unspoken. She mentioned a meeting she had later, something about legal arrangements, about organizing what needed to be handled now that everything had changed. Her words were chosen carefully, each one placed to sound reasonable, responsible. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the table without responding immediately. The chair across from me, Michael's chair, remained empty, untouched. For a moment, I allowed the silence to stretch between us, thin but steady. Then she spoke again, this time more directly. She said it might be best if I started thinking about where I would be more comfortable in the coming weeks. She used gentle words, softer phrases. But the meaning underneath them did not soften. It was clear. She was not asking. She was informing. I lifted the cup to my lips, letting the warmth settle before I answered. I told her I understood. And I did. I understood exactly what she was doing. What surprised her, I think, was that I did not argue. I did not question her timing, her tone, or her decision. I simply nodded, as though we were discussing something ordinary, something expected. For a brief moment, her composure shifted. Just slightly. Enough for me to see it. She had prepared for resistance. For emotion. For a scene she could manage or dismiss. What she had not prepared for was agreement. The rest of the morning passed in quiet routines. She moved through the house making calls, speaking in that same measured voice, discussing documents, accounts, and timelines. I listened without appearing to listen, each word settling into place with the others. Patterns began to form. Connections that had once been hidden now stood clearly in front of me. By the time the clock reached mid-morning, I had finished my coffee and returned the cup to the sink. I dried my hands slowly, deliberately, and looked around the kitchen one more time. It no longer felt like a place I needed to hold on to. That realization did not bring sadness. It brought clarity. Brittany believed she was guiding me toward an exit she had already planned. She believed the house, the decisions, the future now belonged entirely to her. I turned away from the sink and walked back toward the hallway, my steps quiet but certain. Because while she was organizing what she thought was the end of my place here, she had overlooked one simple truth. I had not agreed to leave. Not really. I had only agreed to let her think I would. That afternoon, I did something I had not done in a very long time. I left the house without telling Brittany where I was going. Not out of defiance, not out of secrecy, but because for the first time, I understood that I did not need her permission to move through my own life. The air outside felt sharper, clearer, as if stepping beyond the front door had drawn a line I had not seen before. I drove slowly, my hand steady on the wheel, following a route I knew by memory. The same streets Michael used to take when he drove me to appointments, the same corners where we would stop for coffee on quiet mornings. Nothing had changed out there. Only my place within it had shifted. When I arrived, the building looked exactly as it always had. Modest. Unassuming. The kind of place people overlook unless they have a reason to enter. I parked, turned off the engine, and sat there for a moment, letting the silence settle before I stepped out. Inside, the air carried that familiar scent of paper and polished wood. A receptionist looked up briefly, then nodded with polite recognition. I returned the gesture and continued down the hallway without hesitation. I had been here before. Not recently, but enough to remember where I needed to go. When I reached the office door, I paused only long enough to smooth the sleeve of my coat before knocking. A voice from inside called for me to enter, calm and measured. I stepped in and closed the door quietly behind me. The man behind the desk looked older than I remembered, but his eyes were the same. Observant. Careful. He greeted me by name, not with surprise, but with a kind of quiet understanding that told me he had expected something like this, even if he did not know when it would happen. I sat across from him, placing my hands in my lap, the same way I had done at the funeral, the same way I had done all morning. Composed. Still. I did not rush my words. I did not fill the silence unnecessarily. I simply told him that things had changed. That Michael was gone. That certain decisions were being made without me. He listened without interrupting, his expression steady, his attention focused. When I finished, I reached into my bag and placed the envelope on his desk. The same envelope I had held the night before. Its edges slightly worn, but its contents untouched. He looked down at it, then back at me, and for the first time, there was a subtle shift in his posture. Not surprise. Recognition. He opened it carefully, reading through the documents inside with a level of attention that confirmed what I had begun to suspect. The room remained quiet, the only sound the soft turning of paper. When he finally looked up, his voice was lower, more deliberate. He asked me a few questions, precise and clear, as if placing each piece into a structure that had already begun forming in his mind. I answered calmly, without emotion, because this was not a moment for feeling. This was a moment for understanding. By the time I stood to leave, something had changed. Not in the room, not in the building, but in the balance of everything that had seemed so certain just hours before. As I stepped back into the afternoon light, I felt it settle within me, quiet but undeniable. Brittany believed she was in control because she had taken action first. Because she had moved quickly, quietly, without drawing attention. But she had made one mistake. She had assumed that I had nothing left to stand on. And now, as I walked toward my car with steady, unhurried steps, I understood that she had built her plans on something far less stable than she realized. I returned home just before evening settled in. The sky dimming into a muted blue that made everything look quieter than it really was. The house stood exactly as I had left it, still, composed, almost indifferent to the shift that had taken place beyond its walls. When I stepped inside, I immediately noticed the difference. Brittany had been busy. The dining table was cleared except for a neat stack of documents, aligned with precision. A pen rested on top, placed there deliberately, as if waiting for a signature that had already been decided. I set my keys down gently and walked further in, my steps slow, measured, taking in every detail without reacting. She emerged from the kitchen moments later, her expression composed but alert, like someone who had been waiting for this exact moment. She asked where I had been, her tone light, almost casual, but her eyes were searching, calculating. I told her I had taken care of a few things. Nothing more. She studied me for a second longer than necessary, as if trying to read something that was no longer visible on the surface. Then she gestured toward the table, explaining that there were some documents we needed to review. Practical matters. Necessary steps. Her words were smooth, rehearsed, as though she had already walked through this conversation in her mind. I moved closer, my gaze settling briefly on the papers without touching them. Legal language. Structured sentences. Carefully arranged intentions. I did not need to read every word to understand the direction they were pointing. She began to explain again, outlining timelines, suggesting transitions, framing everything as though it were for my benefit. Comfort. Simplicity. Stability. Each word placed with care, each phrase designed to sound reasonable. I listened the way I had learned to listen over the years. Not to what was being said, but to what was being revealed underneath. When she finished, she paused, waiting. Expecting resistance. Expecting hesitation. Instead, I reached out and adjusted the stack slightly, aligning the edges with a quiet precision that made her blink. I told her I would look over everything in my own time. My voice was calm. Even. There was no urgency in it, no trace of the pressure she had built into the moment. For the first time since I had returned, something shifted in her expression. Not doubt. Not yet. But uncertainty. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. I turned away from the table and walked toward the window, looking out at the yard that had once felt like an extension of my life. The grass had been trimmed recently, the hedges shaped cleanly. Another quiet change I had not approved, but had been done anyway. Behind me, I could feel her watching, waiting for the next move, trying to regain control of a conversation that had not unfolded the way she expected. I let the silence stretch just long enough before speaking again. I told her I appreciated her efforts, that I understood things needed to be handled. And then I added, gently but clearly, that not everything would be decided today. The words settled into the room differently than anything I had said before. They did not challenge her. They did not confront her. But they did something far more important. They drew a line. Brittany did not respond immediately. She nodded slowly, her posture adjusting, her mind already recalculating. I could almost see it happening. The careful shift from assumption to strategy. And as I stood there, watching the fading light stretch across the yard, I understood something with complete clarity. She had been moving pieces on a board she believed was hers. But she had just realized, perhaps for the first time, that she was not the only one still playing. The house grew quieter that night, but it was not the quiet of grief anymore. It was the quiet of distance, of two people moving within the same space but no longer sharing it. I stayed in my room longer than usual, not out of retreat, but out of intention. I needed the stillness. I needed the time to think without interruption. The envelope was no longer hidden in the drawer. It rested on the bed beside me, open now, its contents carefully spread out in front of me. I read through each page slowly, not because I did not understand, but because I wanted to feel the weight of every word. Michael's name appeared again and again, steady, deliberate, unmistakable. There were dates I remembered, signatures I recognized, and details that aligned too precisely to be coincidence. He had not been careless. He had not been passive. He had been preparing. And somehow, I had missed it. Or perhaps I had chosen not to see it, the same way I had chosen not to question Brittany when she began taking control of things that once belonged to him. I traced one line with my finger, pausing at a clause that shifted everything from assumption into certainty. My breath did not change. My expression did not move. But something inside me settled into place, firm and unshakable. Across the hallway, I could hear Brittany on the phone again. Her voice was lower now, more guarded. She spoke in fragments, careful with her words, as if she understood that the walls might not be as silent as she once believed. I caught pieces of conversation. Mentions of timelines. Of expectations. Of things needing to be finalized soon. There was urgency there now, hidden beneath her calm tone. She was accelerating. That alone told me she had felt the shift earlier. She knew something was no longer unfolding according to her plan. I gathered the documents and returned them to the envelope with the same care I had used when opening them. Nothing rushed. Nothing careless. Every movement deliberate. I placed the envelope back into my bag, not hidden, not protected, simply carried. When I stepped into the hallway, the light from the kitchen spilled softly across the floor, casting long shadows that stretched toward me. Brittany ended her call as soon as she saw me, her posture straightening slightly, her expression returning to that composed version of concern she wore so well. She asked if I had looked over the documents on the table. I told her I had not yet. That I would do so in the morning. Again, calm. Again, steady. Her eyes lingered on me for a moment longer than necessary, searching for something she could define, something she could control. But there was nothing there for her to read. Only stillness. I walked past her without hesitation, moving into the kitchen, pouring a glass of water as though this were any other evening, any other moment. The normalcy of it unsettled her more than any argument could have. I could feel it without needing to look. Because people like Brittany do not fear confrontation. They prepare for it. They manage it. What they do not know how to handle is silence that carries intention. I set the glass down and turned slightly, meeting her gaze just long enough to let the quiet stretch between us. Not long. Just enough. Then I moved on, leaving the room as calmly as I had entered it. Behind me, the house remained unchanged. The furniture. The walls. The careful arrangements she had already begun making. But something fundamental had shifted beneath all of it. She believed she was close to finishing what she had started. She believed the outcome was already decided. And as I closed my door that night, the envelope resting within reach, I understood with complete clarity that she had never been further from the truth. Morning came slowly, stretching thin light across the walls as if nothing in this house had changed, as if everything was still exactly where it had always been. I woke before Brittany again, not out of habit this time, but out of purpose. The envelope was already in my hands before I fully sat up, the paper cool and steady against my fingers. I did not need to read it again. I already knew what it said. What mattered now was when and how it would be revealed. I dressed carefully, choosing simple clothes, nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would signal anything unusual. Control, I had learned, often looks like calm. When I stepped into the kitchen, Brittany was already there, standing by the counter with a cup of coffee, her posture composed but tighter than the day before. She greeted me with the same polite tone, but there was a faint edge beneath it now, something sharpened by uncertainty. She asked if I had gone through the documents. I told her I had started. That I would finish today. Her eyes held mine for a moment, searching again, trying to find something she could use. I gave her nothing. I moved past her, poured my coffee, and sat down at the table where her neatly arranged papers still waited. This time, I picked them up. I turned each page slowly, reading. Just enough to confirm what I already understood. Transfers. Authorizations. Language that positioned her as the sole decision maker moving forward. It was all there, carefully constructed, legally framed, and entirely premature. I set the papers down with the same precision she had used when placing them there. Then I reached into my bag and placed my envelope beside them. The contrast was immediate. Her stack was polished, recent, prepared. Mine was older, worn at the edges, but grounded in something far more deliberate. She noticed the shift instantly. Her eyes dropped to the envelope, then lifted back to me, a flicker of tension crossing her face before she smoothed it away. I opened it without hurry, sliding the documents out and placing them one by one on the table between us. I did not explain them. I did not need to. The room felt different as she began to read, her posture still, her expression tightening in small, controlled ways she could not fully hide. Each page seemed to take a little more from her certainty. Each line moved the ground beneath her just slightly further from where she thought it was. When she finally looked up, there was no anger in her face. Not yet. Only calculation, adjusting rapidly, trying to understand how something she had not accounted for was now sitting directly in front of her. I took a slow sip of my coffee before speaking, my voice even, steady, without emphasis. I told her that Michael had been thorough. That he had made decisions long before either of us had been forced to face them. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse her of anything. I simply placed the truth in the space between us and allowed it to exist. She glanced back down at the documents, then back at me, her composure holding but no longer effortless. For the first time since the funeral, she was no longer leading the moment. She was reacting to it. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Full of everything that had been hidden, assumed, rearranged without my consent. I gathered my papers calmly and returned them to the envelope, leaving hers exactly where they were. Then I stood, smoothing the front of my coat with a quiet, practiced motion. I told her we would discuss everything properly, with the right people present, And at the right time. Not today. Not like this. The words were simple, but they carried weight she could not ignore. I turned and walked toward the hallway, my steps steady, my back straight, the same way I had walked through every moment since this had begun. Behind me, I could feel her still at the table, the silence no longer something she controlled. And as I reached my room and closed the door gently behind me, I understood something with complete certainty. She had tried to decide my place in this story. She had tried to write me out of it. But she had forgotten one thing. This was never her story to control.